Hello, Tara here. We're on chapter 11 of Not by Sight. And based on how the previous chapter ended, I think it's going to get just a little bit spicy. We'll have to have a little debate on how spicy you think it is. Pretty low, I think. Chapter 11. What compromise? Suspicion flooded Jack's senses. Hold these, if you please. Two thin objects, wooden sticks, were thrust into his hand. He could detect the faintly sweet scent of spun sugar, candy floss. Jack felt her warm breath tickle the side of his neck as she said, "Now, if you won't remove the entire mask, let me just cut away that awful steel mesh. I'll clip the links—" "No!" Apprehension twisted his insides. He began to sweat. The smell of the candy floss made him nauseous, and he shoved them at her. "Take these now!" "Please, trust me," she said softly. "I want to see you. I want—" Her hand settled against his shoulder, and a shudder tore through him. "Oh!" Jack swallowed, barely able to breathe. "What do you want from me, Grace?" The heat from her touch seeped through his jacket. Jack's pulse pounded in his ears. Why had he brought her here? To grant her wish to see a new place? Or was it more than that? "I've seen the man without the mask," she said close to him, evading his question. "He doesn't frighten me." "I frighten others," he said, recalling Violet's reaction when she'd come to see him in the hospital. The revulsion in her tone when they'd spoken on the telephone. "I'm not like the others." "No, you're far more," he thought. A woman he enjoyed being with each day, sparring wits with, being angry with. A woman who treated him like a man and not some freak, or worse, a victim. "Will you trust me?" she whispered. Jack held his breath. He wanted to. He longed to, in fact. It had been months since he had allowed himself the touch of a woman's hand, even longer for a kiss or an embrace. "Jack?" As she said his name, he released the air from his lungs. He tried to imagine himself revealed to her. How would she react to the ragged scar on his cheek? His valet saw it daily, without seeming the least bit squeamish. Temptation grew as he realized that without the mesh, he'd be able to smell the sea. He could enjoy the mouth-watering flavor of the spun sugar. And Grace? Jack's heart quickened. Would she carry about her the fragrance of perfume? Or smell of the earth, of hay and horses? Did he have the nerve to find out? "Go ahead," he heard himself say. He tensed as she began snipping away one by one the links that kept the mesh in place. Cool air soon assuaged his dampened cheeks, and he caught the strangely familiar scent of flowers. He edged closer to her, trying to determine the exact smell, but could not place it. She still said nothing. As the silence ensued, Jack sat unmoving as though paralyzed, regretting his rashness, while the seconds ticked off. Then he felt her gentle touch graze his cheek alongside the wound, the tips of her fingers soft and warm. He fought the urge to lean into them. Abruptly, she was gone. A moment later, the driver's door opened. She slid onto the seat and closed the door. "I'll trade you." He felt a stick of the candy floss plucked from his grasp and replaced with the wad of mesh steel. "Candy floss was always my favorite as a child. Was it yours?" she asked. She seemed unfazed. Jack eased back into his seat, dropping the steel into his lap before he pulled away a chunk of the spun sugar. "I've always enjoyed it, but my weakness is funnel cakes," he replied. He popped the candy floss into his mouth, savoring the sugar as it dissolved on his tongue. "I love funnel cakes as well. There's a vendor selling them in the hall. Shall I go back and fetch you one?" He shook his head, pulling away another hunk of the featherlight candy. "The bear! Jack, I see the bear walking on the beach!" He grinned and realized how good it felt. I'd hoped you would get the chance to see Margate's unusual spectacle. He turned to her as he tore away another morsel of the candy. Tell me, how shall you write about the scene in your novel? Give me a moment, she said. Jack cocked his head and waited, anticipating her forthcoming narrative. He smiled again. It would undoubtedly be colorful as well as lengthy. She began. Breathing labored, the beast ambles along the beach behind his master, the chains around his limbs and neck dragging in the sand. As if he knows all eyes are amused by him, the proud and fearsome creature appears defeated, held captive by his inability to know his strength. He doesn't realize he could break the chains at any time, overpower the one who holds them. Jack froze, the candy floss like plaster in his mouth. Was that how she saw him? Some miserable circus creature? He tossed the confection out the window. I've had enough, Miss Mabry. Please take me home. Are you all right? Was the concern in her tone pity? He felt exposed and desperately wished he hadn't let her remove the mesh. Now, he demanded, wanting only to retreat to the solace of his rooms. I didn't mean to upset you. Grace couldn't fathom what she'd said or done to cause his abrupt change in mood. She reached out to touch his shoulder. Are you angry I altered your mask? I only wanted you to enjoy being normal. He shoved her hand away. Am I your new cause, then, Miss Mabry? Fix the mask and you fix the freak? His well-formed mouth pulled back, exposing white teeth as he snarled. I would have thought you got your fill inside the menagerie at the Hall by the Sea. He stopped, and Grace saw his throat work. More calmly, he said, Let us be clear. I do not want or need your pity. I do not feel sorry for you one bit, she said, wounded he would misconstrue her intentions. Yes, she'd planned to unmask him on this venture, but not for the reasons he imagined. Pity took no part in her wanting to see his smile or hear his laughter. He was doing neither at the moment. Nor do I wish to be normal. Oh, nor do I wish you to be normal, only to be yourself, she said. Then your wish is granted. His sarcasm was back in full force, on both counts. Ugh, why are you so obtuse? Grace tired of fencing words with him. You are not the sum of your scars, sir. You are simply Jack Benningham, Lord Roxwood, warts and all. An unexpected smile formed on his lips. My, Miss Mabry, what would Reverend Price say about that temper of yours? I never had one until I met you. She huffed out a breath. You do manage to bring out the worst in me. That produced a chuckle from him, and just as she'd been at the costume ball, Grace was arrested by the beauty of his smile. Her heart beat faster. You have very white teeth, she said, before she could stop herself. He was still a handsome man, despite the mask covering his eyes. Lean-faced, he had a strong jaw with just the tiniest dimple at its center, directly below the well-sculpted mouth. Her hands had brushed against those lips as she removed the links from his mask, and she'd felt their firmness. Ooh, get a little spicy there. Her senses teased by the warm scent of his breath as she worked. Oh, I'm so single. She didn't care if removing the mesh made him angry. She preferred this view of him, a man whose features she could readily identify. She then realized he was clean-shaven. Do you handle your own razor? My valet takes care of it. So you allow him to see your face? She said, hurt that he would allow a servant what he'd refused to show her. Does the sight of you throw him into paroxysms of terror? He sees only what you see now. The rest of him remained a mystery then. The only freakish thing about you is the vile mask, she said. You could take it off. I've even brought a hat for you to wear just in case. Since she'd expected him to rage, his weary tone surprised her. Why do you insist on trying to save me, Miss Mabry? Because you refuse to save yourself. she thought. My reasons merely stem from curiosity, she said instead. I've been in your employ 11 days already, and as I've told you, I want to see with whom I'm speaking. Do you think it unreasonable? No, not unreasonable. He sighed. Impossible. Why? Miss Mabry, I'd be a liar if I told you I didn't enjoy your company. You've got intelligence, and your honesty is refreshing. You're also a good driver, and I'm certain one day you will make a splendid novelist. But you are innocent to the ways of the world and its ugliness. Trust me when I say you do not want to see this face. He turned away. I do! She reached for him again and felt the muscles of his arms tense. I have seen you. In the hedge maze, remember? I am not naive, just curious to know you better. You are not what they say. You don't know what I am. The lines at his mouth conveyed more frustration than anger. Now please do not press me further. Grace felt as though she'd lost some important battle. Heart aching, she threw away the rest of her candy floss and exited the car to crank over the engine. The ride back seemed to take forever. She was relieved to finally drive past the gatehouse onto Roxwood's estate. He didn't say a word to her once the car halted, and he opened the door. Grace watched him, tears brimming at her lashes. It seemed they must start over again. The sun was hot as Grace took a break from her raking to stretch her muscles and gaze up at the clear morning sky. Breathing deeply, she imagined tasting the air, fresh and clean, so unlike the sooty odor of London in winter, or the insidious stench permeating parts of the city in summer. How would she describe it to Jack? The air tasted of sunshine and freshly mown grass. As if he would listen, she thought with a pang as she returned to the task of spreading cut hay. After Monday's debacle at Margate, she'd called for him yesterday. Knowles had announced he wasn't up for an outing. The butler actually looked sympathetic, an expression foreign to his rough features. No, she'd gone too far in removing the steel mesh. He'd been angry with her afterward, believing her attention to him stemmed from pity, the furthest thing from the truth. Grace paused again with a rake. She did like being with him, and more than just a little. She'd certainly noticed when she was not. And though she enjoyed the company of her WFC sisters, being with Jack made her feel different. Her senses became heightened, her pleasure more intense as they bantered with each other and played the guessing game. The realization that he might never send for her again made her feel hollow inside. Should she return to the manor and apologize? "Penny for your thoughts," Claire called to her, manning a rake just a few yards away. "Missing the Daimler?" Grace looked up and forced a smile. "He's engaged, you know." Claire bent back to the task of spreading hay. "I'm well aware of that," Grace said, annoyed at her friend's keen perception. "But I hurt his feelings terribly the other day, and I wish I knew a way to make it up to him. Engaged or not, Claire, he's still a human being." "Be careful, Grace," Claire said. "Don't worry. Really, it's just that we've grown accustomed to one another. I don't know if you could consider us friends. He's my employer and I'm his chauffeur." A smirk formed on Claire's lips. "Of course you are." She raked out another pile of hay. "Just don't get hurt." "A letter for you, Miss Mabry." Mr. Tillman scowled as he arrived during their lunch to hand Grace a crisp, white invitation. "I've got better things to do than run messages back and forth for young ladies." He eyed her sharply from beneath bushy brows. "If it needs responding, you can do it yourself." With that, he turned on his heel and strode back across the field. "I don't think that farmer's going to forgive you, Grace." Becky sat in the grass near her feet, eating one of the buttermilk scones she'd made for their breakfast that morning. "It's the shovel, or maybe the pigs. He hasn't gotten over either one." Lucy took a bite of her carrot. She was still perched atop the horse-driven tractor mower. What's in the letter, miss? Agnes asked, looking curious from her grassy spot across from Becky. Grace's mouth went dry as she stared at the embossed linen envelope. Surely he wouldn't fire her with an invitation. She opened it and read the scrawled lines of Jack's steward, Mr. Edwards. I've been invited to dine with Lord Roxwood. This evening, in fact. She glanced up and saw Agnes's brow pucker, while Becky waved her arms and cried, "The Tin Man's falling in love with Grace!" Nonsense. Grace felt her face heat as she glanced back at the invitation. We had a row on Monday. He probably wishes to repair our truce. Grace risked a glance at Claire, seated alongside her in the grass. What do I know? Claire shrugged, then went back to eating her apple butter sandwich. That's it? It's not a sandwich. Just to be fair, that's not a sandwich. That's a treat. But I watched you unpack your bags. At least you have a decent dress to wear to your truce. The summer sun still shone above the tree line when Grace arrived at the manor for dinner. Knowles answered her summons, and his face brightened at the sight of her. Grace offered a shy smile. She'd taken special care with her toilette this evening, and while her gown was simple compared to the clothes in her wardrobe at home in London, the embroidered white cotton summer dress made her feel quite pretty. My lady? Knowles offered a slight bow, then retreated to allow her entrance. May I say you look enchanting this evening? Her smile broadened. Why, you certainly may, Knowles. Thank you. He bowed again. If you'll follow me to the library. He led her in a direction opposite the study, and she marveled again at the tasteful simplicity of the house. The high ceilings were edged with gilt friezes, while neutral-colored walls enhanced the gold and green rugs covering the polished wood floors. Knowles stopped in front of a pair of heavy double doors and opened them. Miss Mabry, my lord, he said, allowing her to enter. Jack stood beside a walnut divan covered in soft green and beige striped fabric. The massive Turkish rug at his feet held similar shades, along with reds, blues, and browns. A pair of potted palms in brass urns stood on either side of two floor-length windows draped in dark gold velvet and snow-white shears. Thank you for accepting my invitation, Miss Mabry. Jack wore standard dinner dress of white tie and tails. Grace admired the way the black jacket stretched across his broad shoulders. Them broad shoulders, contrasting sharply with his white waistcoat and shirt front. He looked quite dashing but for the mask, though she was pleased he'd left off the mesh. You're quite welcome, Lord Roxwood. Shall I have Knowles pour us a sherry? That would be lovely. Grace glanced at the butler, who bowed and went to a side table, returning with two amber-filled glasses served up on a silver tray. She smiled at him, taking a glass. My lord? Knowles hovered with the tray. Jack extended a hand, into which the butler deftly slipped the other glass of sherry. To good company, he said, raising his glass. Grace lifted hers as well. And may I say, your lordship, the entire staff wishes you a very happy birthday. Grace paused with the sherry to her lips. It's your birthday? Another year older. He hesitated, though I have grown none the wiser. Silence reigned for a few seconds before the butler said, I'll see about dinner, my lord. Knowles left the drawing-room and closed the doors behind him. Please, Grace, take a seat. She chose the chair next to the divan. You have a beautiful home, Grace said, her pulse pounding with new awareness of him. They were alone in the same room. Ah! Although it seemed laughable when she considered they were much that way each day on their outings together. This was different, however. She wasn't being paid to be here, and he'd asked her to dinner on his birthday. Grace wished she would have known earlier. She could have purchased a gift in the village. He took a seat on the divan, then a quick sip of his sherry. I wish to apologize for my behavior on Monday. He spoke without preamble. I know you had the best intentions while I... His lopsided smile pierced her with warmth. I'm afraid I still have difficulty believing anyone sees me as anything other than the village troll. But you're not that at all, Grace assured him, moving to the edge of her seat. You're quite the opposite. Seeing his quick flash of teeth, she added, While I don't care for the mask, it does lend you an air of mystery, like Eric in Gaston Leroux's The Phantom of the Opera. His smile faded. I read the novel when it came out a few years ago. As I recall, Eric was a miserable soul, and the beautiful Christine pitied him. She straightened in her seat. Well, as I haven't the slightest twinge of sentiment in your regard, the comparison is probably inaccurate. Still, I am glad you've left off the steel mesh. You have a nice smile, you know. He gifted her with one then, and her breath caught before she asked, Have you spoken with your family today? My mother called earlier to wish me good tidings. He paused. She conveyed my father's sentiments as well. Grace sipped at the amber liquid, enjoying its warmth against her throat. It was a shame Jack and his father weren't able to bridge the divide in their relationship. It made her angry, too. Hugh was dead, while the Earl of Stonebrook had a remaining son. By allowing his grief of the past to blind him, he missed the love he could have in the present with Jack. She thought to ask if Miss Arnold had called, but decided against it, enjoying their current equanimity. Grace hadn't forgotten their conversation about arranged marriages. The drawing-room doors opened. Dinner, my lord, the butler said. Shall we, Miss Mabry? Jack rose and approached her chair, offering his arm. Grace stood and tucked her hand into the crook of his elbow. I hope you have an appetite. Mrs. Riley has prepared my favorite dish, baked salmon. One of my favorites, she said. A moment later, they walked into the dining room and moved toward the elegant table. The white linen cloth held candles, fine bone china, and crystal goblets. 2 bouquets of roses garnished the table with their beauty. Knowles showed Grace to her chair beside Jack, who sat at the head of the table, while an older woman in cap and apron, Mrs. Riley, she presumed, brought in the first course. Grace was surprised a footman didn't carry out the task. Carrot soup, my lord, and just as you like it. Next, the woman placed a serving before Grace. Thank you, Mrs. Riley, Jack said. My lord. She curtsied while Grace inhaled the soup's spicy aroma of ginger and cinnamon. This smells delicious. When Mrs. Riley beamed at her, it struck Grace how different the cook's pleasant expression was from that of her brother, Mr. Tillman, who wore an interminable frown. She retreated, and minutes passed in companionable silence as Grace and Jack enjoyed their food. Knowles had come around to pour a delicate white wine, and then removed himself to a discreet distance behind Jack, so as to give them a measure of privacy. I admit it's much easier dining this way, he said, taking a spoonful of the soup. Before, I'd have to remove my mask, then replace it after the meal. Grace glanced toward Knowles. What about the servants? They have always been instructed to leave the room. I wish my privacy when I eat. But you allow me to be here? Affection brewed in her as she tried to keep her tone light. Grace was thrilled he would trust her enough to share what he considered a kind of intimacy. Ooh, intimacy. I am still wearing my mask, he reminded her, and her euphoric mood dimmed. But I wanted you to share in my birthday. Her spirits buoyed again. I am honored, she said with sincere warmth. Mrs. Riley brought in the next course, baked salmon topped with lemon wedges and served alongside slices of seasoned boiled potatoes and a medley of cooked vegetables from the garden, beans, tomatoes, peas, carrots, and rhubarb. Huh. I don't think I've ever had rhubarb in that kind of a mix. I've only ever had it as like a dessert. Everything is set just as you like it, my lord. She placed his meal before him, doing the same with Grace. I suppose with the war on you're without a footman? She asked, once the woman had left. No, I keep a footman on hand, though Gaines is too old for service overseas. Grace noticed Jack used his fork to poke at each item on his plate. Seeming satisfied all of his food was sufficiently dead, he began to eat. Afraid your salmon will swim off the plate? She teased. I see you jabbing it with your fork as if it's still moving. His cheeks colored faintly, and Grace regretted her remark. Had she blundered again? His rueful smile reassured her. I like to know exactly where everything is on my plate. Don't want to bite into any surprises. Meat at 7 o'clock. He stabbed at the salmon. Potatoes at 12 o'clock. Green vegetables at 3. He indicated with his fork the 2 other servings. Always the same, and the reason Mrs. Riley serves my meals. Grace stared down at her plate. Lord Roxwood, I didn't mean to pry. No harm done. And when we're alone, please call me Jack. I like hearing you say my name. Then he said, Knowles, you may go. Leave the bottle of wine. Very good, my lord. The butler set the wine on the table between them. I would like it if you would call me Grace, she said when he'd left. Jack answered with a smile and a nod, then speared a chunk of the fish and began eating. Grace did the same. I didn't properly thank you the other day for taking me to Margate. It was all quite fascinating. She darted a glance at him, noting how his strong and capable hands deftly wielded the fork or reached for his glass of wine. If one didn't know he was blind, he could fool even the most critical eye. It was my pleasure, Grace. I meant what I said. His tone softened, and he stretched one of those hands along the table in her direction. I've come to appreciate your company and your honesty. Grace faltered with a forkful of vegetables to her lips. She hadn't been completely honest with him, had she? Of course, she should tell him about the white feather right now. Seeing his unguarded smile, she hesitated. It was his birthday, after all. It would be heartless to ruin it for him. She took his hand instead, and as soon as she touched him, her heart began pounding like Nessa's racing hooves along the cobbled streets in Westminster. I've enjoyed our time together myself, she said quietly. You've helped me see things in ways I never could before, and experience emotions I've never felt before. She thought that last sentence. She didn't say it out loud. He squeezed her fingers, and the heat from his touch ignited her senses. And you are my eyes, sweet Grace. His deep voice caressed her like a warm summer breeze. And so much more. I wish to see him now! Their hands broke apart as the doors to the dining room burst open. A fashionably attired woman stood on the threshold, while Knowles, looking distraught, stood behind her. My lord, I tried to have her wait. It's all right. Jack removed his napkin and rose from his chair. Good evening, Violet. Violet Arnold? Grace's fork clattered against her plate. She vaguely recognized her from a newspaper photograph. With her golden hair piled high beneath a stylish plum-colored hat, wearing a smart linen traveling suit of the same shade, she appeared far more beautiful in person. Ignoring Jack, she cast a derisive glance at Grace. I have tried calling several times to send a car to meet me at the train station. Each time that man Edwards said you were out. I was out. Jack's tone sounded lackluster. I've been in my gardens most of the day. Miss Arnold finally turned to face him. A flash of distaste crossed her unblemished features. Whatever for? I wanted to enjoy my roses. Wearing that horrid mask? She quickly averted her gaze. Fury coursed through Grace. So this was the woman he was to marry next month? No wonder Jack felt so inadequate. It was obvious she wanted nothing to do with him. The last time I checked, Violet, my sense of smell was still intact. Irritation colored his words as he fumbled around the table. Grace stood too. You purposefully ignored me, she insisted, and now you're having a cozy dinner with... Miss Mabry. She's with the Women's Forage Corps. To Grace, he said, Miss Violet Arnold is... His fiancée, the blonde interjected. Wow, I'm having a world of trouble. It's nice to meet you, Miss Arnold. Grace approached to extend a hand to the other woman. Miss Arnold made no attempt to take it. Instead, the dark brown eyes appraised her. And I suppose having dinner with the future heir of Stonebrook is a part of your duty in the women's... What did you call it? The Women's Forage Corps, Grace said. We harvest and bale hay, then deliver it to a designated station to be shipped overseas to the British forces. Hay? How tedious! She gave her palm a slap with her lavender gloves. I'm surprised you feel that way, Miss Arnold, she said. I mean, with your own country's recent entry into the war. Violet Arnold seemed unconcerned as she took in Grace's summer dress. So, why is a baler of hay up at the manor enjoying a formal dinner? Miss Mabry is on my staff, Jack asked. Doing what? Grace felt Violet Arnold's second swift perusal. She works as my driver in the mornings. In the afternoons, she is employed by the WFC. Then you should have been there to fetch me hours ago, she said to Grace. Grace stiffened. Before she could form a proper retort, Jack asked, Why are you here, Violet? If you recall, we still have important matters to discuss. Privately. She cut a glance at Grace before continuing. Do you keep a lady's maid here at the house, Benningham? Brown became ill just before we boarded at the station in London, and I had to send her home. Violet, I only employ critical staff at Roxwood. Which should include a suitable lady's maid, Violet said. She turned to arch a delicate brow at Grace. I don't suppose that's a part of your job description. Indeed not, Grace said, horrified at the notion of being ordered about by such a haughty woman. She saw Jack's fists clench. However, she said slowly as an idea formed, I might offer you instead the services of my own maid. She nearly laughed at the startled look on Miss Arnold's face. Agnes is here with me, working for the Women's Forage Corps. I feel uncertain, with the proper incentive, she would act as lady's maid during your stay. Will it suit? Jack asked. I suppose, but I wish to meet her first. Done. Below the mask, Jack's jaw eased. He unclenched his fists as well. Miss Mabry, if your maid agrees, tell her I'll double her wages. I wish to speak with her directly. That is, if you've finished your little evening together. Violet Arnold looked at Grace, then at Jack. I've had a trying day, and I'd like to get settled in as quickly as possible. With that, she whirled from the dining room, and Grace heard her calling orders to the frazzled butler. Poor Agnes. She had regrets about volunteering her friend to act as the woman's maid. No one should have to put up with such arrogance. Perhaps she should demand triple wages for her friend. She turned to Jack. I suppose your birthday party is over. I'm sorry, Grace. He left his place beside the table and came to her. I didn't expect her to arrive. You don't need to apologize. I just feel badly because your celebration's been ruined. She noted the blonde hoyden hadn't even wished him a birthday greeting. It was hardly ruined. He smiled and held out his hand to her. It was a moment before she took it. I've enjoyed our evening very much. It was lovely, she said, wishing she could stay longer. She enjoyed seeing his expressions, his smiles. She wanted to know more about his grandfather and the memorable times he'd shared with his brother, about his unbending father, the Earl, and what it was like being a second son and the new heir to Stonebrook, forced to marry a woman he didn't love. Jack, she said, wanting some kind of reassurance this new connection between them wasn't at an end. Shall I call for you in the morning? I need to continue my word-painting lessons, you know. I'm certain the outspoken ones could use more color. Not tomorrow, he said, giving her hand a squeeze. Edwards will let you know when I'm available. All right. She struggled to keep the disappointment from her voice. I'll send Agnes over directly. Good night. She pulled her hand from his and turned toward the door. Grace Mabry? Yes? She spun around. Thank you. A smile touched his lips. Being in your company tonight is the best gift I've received in a very long time." A bittersweet yearning rose in her, touching her heart. "You are most welcome, Jack." As she exited the manor, Grace found Knowles lugging a large steamer trunk and several portmanteaus inside from the porch steps. Yet, despite the proof of Miss Arnold's presence, Grace's pleasure over Jack's words refused to fade. Poor Jack, getting his birthday ruined by Violet. But on a spicy level, I'd say that was maybe a 3 or a 4. No, that was a solid 3 on the spicy scale. 3 out of 10. What do you guys think?